anything that you put out there, assume that it gets out. So you have to be real careful of the language. You can't say things like, we don't want people to know. It's
we laugh about that, but people have done it.
You're listening to the Help Me with HIPAA podcast, where HIPAA and humor collide to make learning fun. Your delightful hosts are Donna Grindle and David Sims. Relax. HIPAA help is on the way.
Welcome to the Help Me with HIPAA podcast. My name is David Sims with HIPAA for MSPs, and joining me today we have a guest, Karen Phillips with Phillips and Marek. And we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic that people rarely think about until it's too late. We're talking about PR and, what to do when you have a data breach and how that communication looks. And it's not something you want to figure out in the midst of a data breach. You want to do that beforehand. So welcome to the show, Karen.
Thanks, David, and thanks for having me. Our company, Phillips and Marek, has been around for a long time, and we specialize in public relations and marketing in the technology and in the medical field. And we do a lot of advocacy work too. And data breach PR is a whole new beast in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to kind of give everybody a little heads up, you and I were at the Pri-State boot camp that we had not long ago, and you did some presentations and talks about that. And it really honestly is one of these areas that I don't think people talk about very often. It's, like you've told me in the past, you said, people look at, do we have IT and do we have data security and what are we doing about compliance and how are we going to notify patients? And they think about all those things, but what they typically will overlook is how are we going to handle this fallout, this public relations nightmare that's going to happen? Right. Who are we going to put in front of the camera, so to speak?
And most organizations don't have the right person on their staff to handle that either. I mean, even a lot of hospital systems, there may be a big hospital system would, because they typically have fantastic PR departments, but if you've got a medical practice with multiple locations, you've probably got a great marketing person, a great social media person, not necessarily that person that has sort of the journalistic slant to create the messaging that needs to go out. And it's not just messaging to the media, it's messaging internally. You've got to think about, how do you notify all of your employees? How do you make sure that your internal spokespeople are ready? And there's so many layers to it. So a lot of times companies and even big hospital systems will look for someone on the outside that's done this before, that knows and works very, very closely with the attorney and with all of the technology folks and the CEO to time all of the messaging and prepare everybody for, what could be massive fallout.
Right. Yeah, I know sometimes I've seen times when a breach will happen and often the person will be told, don't say anything to anybody. We need to have our PR person in front of it. And it never fails. The media will find somebody who didn't get that memo.
Right. Exactly.
And they'll say something they shouldn't have said, and it becomes another fallout. It's like you're already dealing with a data breach, or you're already dealing with some kind of incident, and now you've got that to now deal with.
Yeah, and so the ideal situation is to know who that person's going to be, or that team is going to be before anything ever happens. And then if you know who your spokespeople are, and even in employee orientations or employee meetings, it's not a bad thing. When you talk about HIPAA compliance with your employees and when you have just your regular meetings, it's always a good reminder. If anything happens, your employees need to know there's a plan in place to handle this, and it's not their responsibility to speculate or try to field questions if something happens at the last minute, because everything needs to come from the top. And that's the communications challenge. How do you get everybody on the same page very, very quickly when it starts?
Right. So I know that internally there's a lot of things that we need to cover and things that we need to do. But how does we'll just say small provider, because you said the hospital systems typically already have these people in place. So assuming we're talking about people who don't have somebody in place to do PR, I'm assuming they would hire an outside firm to do that. And so what are some things that a listener should to look for or try to put somebody in place to handle that before something happens?
Yeah. So, and a lot of times people will go through their HIPAA technology vendor or their attorney who's handling this to find a PR person that can do all of these things for them. And that in an ideal world, that person needs to be employed or hired by the attorney. So you've got attorney-client privilege right there, and nothing. You think you've got a lot of leeway in the messaging as a communicator, but when it comes to this situation, you put out nothing without the attorney's approval. So you are joined at the hip with your attorney anyway. Mm-hmm. But you're really looking for someone who's experienced in crisis communication, who knows how to message to the media, who knows how to message in a way that, what you don't want is everybody in the clinic or the hospital or your offices trying to tell patients what happened. And you don't want to tell them not to talk, because then that's misconstrued too, because everything that you put out there in any way at all, in writing or on video or online, is discoverable should it end up in court. So it has to be so carefully orchestrated, and the messaging is nuanced. To your employees, it needs to be, here's the situation. You can be very upfront with them. Here's the situation. Here's what's happened. Here's what we're doing about it. Here's what you need to do, because we need to keep this panic out of the clinic, out of the patient setting. And that's really the message for employees. It's work as usual for everybody who's not involved in the breach situation. You do your job. Let us handle the communications with your client or with your patients. So, and getting that message out to everybody quickly is challenging, because if you've got shifts of people coming in, if you've got offices that all have different hours, how do you give everybody the same message after there's a breach? So what we've done before is a video with the CEO, and because not everybody can be in the same meeting and hear the same message. So a video with the CEO that we shot over Zoom. And, in fact, it goes so fast when there's a data breach that, one day we said we need a video. That night, I'm writing the video script, sending it back and forth to the attorney until midnight, and we're shooting it the next day. So those things go so fast. Edit it in about an hour, and then the day after that, it's in the hands of all the clinic managers. And so, we had a process that people came into work. The first thing they needed to do was check with their manager, look at the video that's on an iPad or whatever your media is. Sign off that you saw it, that you understand it. And then there was a companion flyer that was posted, because the three messages that we wanted everybody to know is that the organization needs to speak with one voice. We can't be saying all different things. Certainly, we want everybody to lead with compassion. We gave them some verbiage to use. It's, we know this is upsetting and we're dealing with it. And then the third thing is triage those questions out of the clinic. So we had business cards set up or printed very quickly, where anyone in any of the clinics could hand a patient a business card, say, here's a number on it. I don't have the answers. I just know that our technology team is working on it. We have the right experts in place. Call this number if you have additional questions, because this was before the call center was even set up. And the number one thing is avoid speculation, because that's human nature to, we had a data breach, I guess what could have happened is this, that, and the other. That turns into a big mess. That's what ends up in the newspaper if somebody gets hold of that. And that may be totally wrong. Yeah.
Now, when you do these, I'm assuming that you would do a video, even though it's going to be an internal video, you probably assume that it's going to get out. Is that right?
Anything that you put out there, assume that it gets out. So you have to be real careful of the language. You can't say things like, we don't want people to know. It's
we laugh about that, but people have done it.
It does. It gets out there. And this one example that I'm referring to, I don't know of an incident where it got out there, but it did. Somebody showed their husband, their friend, talked about it. So it's just every time you communicate, it's It's like if I'm sitting in a witness box in a courtroom, I could show this, I could say this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you have to be very careful.
Yeah, because you may very well end up in a witness
Right.
box in the courtroom.
Exactly. You never know, what a mess it'll turn into. And really, you just don't want to upset people so much. The nice thing is, well, the good thing and the bad thing. I'll start with the bad thing. People are used to data breaches now. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, I got another letter and my data was compromised. Okay, it's Tuesday. It's like it's such a common occurrence that people don't hit the panic button like they used to. But it's still important. It's still, there are people who do still hit the panic button. And, our firm set up the internal escalation line. And I fielded those calls. I was actually going to start fielding the internal calls and then pull in one of my employees to kind of take it over. And I never did that because I learned so much from those calls that I use that information in the messaging. So, anybody who's, at the very beginning, before the call center was set up, they have questions. I had a soft phone, so, I looked like I was internal, but I never said I'm an employee. If anybody asks, I tell them exactly who I am and I'm hired to do this. Mm-hmm. And usually people are okay with that. Usually they don't care. But if they do, you've got to already have a plan to triage that to an internal person, and maybe that's your compliance officer.
Right.
And then there's got to be the system in place to log every call, every question, every time you triage to somebody else. And in that case, that was, a cloud-based HIPAA compliant spreadsheet that we all completed.
Well, I imagine that most people, when they're calling, they're not calling necessarily to find out what's going on. They're calling to find out, is my appointment still there? How do I get the medication I need? And how do I get this prescription I'm supposed to pick up? And can you tell me if my appointment has been moved to a different day or what? Just all these normal things that typically during like a data breach, maybe the practice can't look up. Like we can't tell you when your appointment is. We don't have that. Which I know some practices, they get in the habit of literally printing that information out, like on a Monday for the week or something like that, so that if something happens, you can refer back to paper and look at when those things are.
Right. And those calls didn't so much come to the escalation line. I'm sure they got those in the clinic.
Gotcha.
The ones that I would get were, people upset about it and just wanted to be heard. But fewer people were upset than I might have imagined. Now, the nice thing is when the call center goes online, because most organizations, if they have a data breach, will engage a call center. And that call center is typically the one that sends out all of the notifications, and if I recall correctly, it was like about 80% wanted email notifications and maybe it was 20 wanted mail. And so here's a lesson learned. If at all possible, that mail should go out from the client, from the organization that had the data breach, even though the call center did it, on their letterhead and look like it was totally like a call center involved in it, because that's where people I found a little confused. It's like, well, we got this mail from this call center. I've never heard of them, but it's all about my practice, my doctor's office, and I don't know if it's legitimate or not. So I think there's ways that you can kind of smooth that out. But one thing that a PR person will do, and I think can be very instrumental, is helping get the call center ready. Because that's a whole process. Certainly there's the technical side, which, is not my thing, but the messaging, I write the Q&A doc, for it. And then kind of the process of escalate, like, if somebody called that call center after they got the letter and they're not satisfied with what happens there, then they would call me. And then if I can't satisfy them, then it goes to somebody internal. So that was a nice workflow. But it was usually, I would say 80% of the calls I got were, is this legitimate? Is this a thing? Because they just want to make sure that, or it's like, okay, well, I have a question about this. And they read you the answer of the question that they're calling about. It's just like they just need that touch point. You do get the people who just want to be heard and are upset, and you're not going to talk them down. You just need to listen to them. But those are few and far between, I think. But one thing I also found was that you have to QC that call center as well.
Oh, I bet.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I had a few people pop onto the escalation line who would give me answers back that they heard from the call center. And I'm like, I wrote the script. That's not quite right. And so then we started doing a pretty heavy QC program with the call center, having kind of, the retail secret shopper kind of model where, people call and ask questions, and that worked out real well because you can figure out who the employees are in the call center on your account that they need more training or replacement pretty quickly. So not a lot of that, but you do get a little bit. And that's an important component to make sure that, you're not assuming that they're sticking to the script. You got to make sure they are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Karen, you've put together a very nice PDF checklist, and people love checklists. Matter of fact, I think you should live by checklists, honestly. So I want to go down this checklist because this is whether you've got PR people internally, you're a hospital system, or whether you're a small provider and you're going to have to outsource this, you still have to do these things in this checklist. And so I want to leave our listeners today with kind of things to think about and ask yourself, do you have these things in your checklist? And so let's start with number one. And we have touched on some of these already, but we'll go back over these. So the first one is selecting the spokesperson for the organization.
Right. So all the employees need to be very, very clear that, they're not empowered to speak on behalf of the organization for this, that there are people who have been chosen to do this and trained to do this. It should be your CEO. It should be your HIPAA compliance officer, your head of technology, maybe, whoever those people are. It should not be your PR person. It really needs to be somebody with credibility and authority within your organization. And those people need to be trained. And, because things happen so quickly in a data breach, I prepare spokespeople over the phone a lot of times. We'll just have a phone call and I'll just drill them with questions. And I always say, sounds stupid with me, with the media, or with an upset patient. So because we know what sounds great in your head, exactly what you want to say in your head doesn't always come out of your mouth that way.
Yeah.
And I think when I watch this podcast or listen to this podcast back, I'm gonna see that in myself too. I was like, God, I thought I was going to say that so eloquently. So even I do that. But we know we've got to drill and we've got to kind of figure out how this needs to be messaged and practice it a little bit, even if it's a 30-minute phone call.
Yeah. No, honestly, if I could add to your list, because I'm kind of looking at your things here, I don't see it. If I had to add something to your list, it would definitely be do tabletop exercises, or add this to your tabletop exercise, because
for sure.
Honestly, if you're going through these tabletop exercises of what to do when there's a data breach, and this is not part of it, the PR part's not part of it, then you're going to have a problem. And so this should be one of those things that you do. So this checklist of things we're going through should be part of, let's sit down and understand, do we have these things already in place? And if we don't, we need to do that now before there's a problem. On the fly training is not something you want to do in PR work.
Well, and let me tell you what's very common too. And this was when I was doing a lot of media relations work with a big hospital system in Houston, had nothing to do with a data breach. But there was one very prominent doctor I worked with a lot, and he was my key spokesperson for a lot of press conferences, and he was amazing. International reputation. But when you put a camera in front of him, he always wanted to be the authority on it. And if he didn't know the answer, he would make up statistics. I'm like, I'm standing in the back going, what are you talking about?
Isn't that what the politicians do?
And so I would have, our whole office for the rest of the day doing literature searches, trying to figure out how can we sort of make this work if we're called on it?
Yeah.
And sometimes we were. And so, part of it is also letting people really know that if you don't know the answer, it's okay to say that. And they get in their head that I'm the spokesperson and I have to know everything. And if I don't, I'm going to make it up. And that goes sideways every time.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I tell people too is that I don't care how charismatic the person is. Sometimes the camera will suck your soul out. Like, it's so funny. A friend of mine, he owns Bigger Brains, and they do a lot of video training. And I recall years ago, Don and I went down to his studio and we were going to film some HIPAA training. And I swear to you, we were top notch in everything that we practiced until he turned that camera on, and it was like,
That's true. That's very true. I had, with that same hospital system, I had a doc who was very charismatic and warm with, the 101, but he would fig leaf every time. And I you could probably imagine what that looked like.
Yeah.
Hands go down, the body's stiff. And it's like, okay, where's that warmth? And that takes a little practice for some people.
It does, man. I tell you, it's bad enough that the eye of the camera's looking at you, but then when they turn that bright light on it on top, I'm telling you, it's something that should be practiced along with everything else.
Oh, for sure. And if you're doing a lot of media interviews, the skill set's different for broadcast versus radio versus print.
It is.
Versus something on Zoom. It's just all very different.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings us to the next tip, which is very important, which is drafting the message.
Yeah. I mean, I always want to have at least, usually it's 3 key messages. Whenever you're delivering in any format on anything, essentially you can boil everything down to 3 key messages. And here it's what's happened, when and how was the incident discovered, and then what's the organization doing in response. I mean, those were our 3 key messages that we kind of kept going back to. And then of course you drill down from those, and then you teach people how to bridge back to those, because a lot of times if you're in an interview, people might want to take you a different direction. It's like, oh, I hear your hospital system is laying off. Okay, well, we don't want to talk about that right now, do we? And so how do you bridge back? And sometimes, you just kind of got to bring people back to center. And those key messages are important for your employees too. You don't want to give more information than anybody. You want to be transparent, but don't give more information than anybody needs. And the details are coming out slowly anyway. So things can change. And once you put it out there, it's kind of like reporting on medical research. It's like, okay, this week coffee is good. And then if next week you say coffee is now bad, it's like, well, no, coffee's good. It's still in my brain. And so that's kind of how this works too. You don't put anything out there that you don't want to stick.
Yeah, because you'll have that person that says, "I told them this was going to happen at some point."
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
So, and that segues pretty well into the next tip you have here, which is training your spokespeople. And we talked a little bit about training them to be in front of the camera or whatever, but it's also to make sure that they can do this in the heat of the moment.
Right. And that goes back to the practice, and to your point, it's a great tabletop exercise. So you're, in an ideal world, you're not saying these words for the very first time when it hits the fan. It's just got to be something that rolls off the tongue with the specific details. So yeah, I mean, we kind of hit on a lot of that. It's your messaging. It's your, you want to control the message, but you don't want to say we're going to control the message. You never want to say that one out.
Yeah. Well, it's the whole crisis communication thing. And I remember years ago, I did a crisis communication. It was a relationship crisis communication, which I thought was very interesting because there's a parallel between business related crisis communication and then crisis communication within a relationship, whether that's a marriage or a friend or whatever. It's very similar in that you want to be very careful about what you say. You want to not be emotional about what you're saying, which you think, okay, this is a business setting, but you can get very emotional about it. It's very stressful and you might feel like you're being attacked and you're taking things personally. And so you have to be careful with that. So yeah, that whole crisis communication thing is very key.
100%. And the employees and vendors, I didn't mention vendors, but it's important to get your vendors on board with this as well. It depends on how closely they work with you, but sometimes your vendors are an important audience to focus on as well. And it's people take their cues from the top. And if the top, if leadership and the key people in the technology space are all like, we got this, we're working through it, we are not panicked. You might be panicked in their conference room, but you can't be panicked outside.
Yeah. In my experience, I think one of the things that does the most harm is there's a rush to point fingers when things happen. And that is the wrong time to try to figure that out. You want to, let's get the situation under control and let's figure things out, as far as who's to blame later. But there's a, big rush to do that. And it's, that kills, I think, the relationship that needs to be there to get through the incident that's happening.
Yeah. You can keep it simple at the beginning. We know an incident happened, maybe throw in a few facts that are solid. And, we are investigating to see what the implications are.
Well, I noticed in your drafting the message, you said, what happened and, when and how the incident, but nowhere did you ask the question of why. And that's usually when I see people, why did this happen? Why did this happen? We don't know yet.
Yeah, we don't know. We don't know. And, and when we find out, we will deal with it, and we will put all the measures in place to not let it happen again. And that's all you can message.
Yeah. So the next one here, you've got develop a rapid internal communications plan. So what exactly is that? That sounds like a good acronym for something.
It should be, right? It should be. Now, we touched on that a little bit about, some of the things you can do, but, how do you tell all these employees all over the place and vendors what happened before it hits either the media or before it hits, before the patients start coming in and talking about it. So, we talked a little bit about the video. How do you get the video out there quickly? Maybe it's a corporate-wide meeting. It just depends on your organization. What does that look like? And it's different in every organization, but figuring it out the night before isn't fun. So, it's just whatever it looks like in your company, you need to put that in place and let everybody know that's the process. If you can do it ahead of time, then you're light years ahead of most people who have a data breach.
Yeah, and I'm sure
we hear Donna all the time talk about it's not if you're going to have a data breach, it's when. And so why not put this in place? Because you're saving yourself a lot of gray hair if you do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is the next one's the hard one, determining how to notify those people who are affected.
Yeah. So, again, we touched just briefly on that earlier. It's like, okay, it really comes down to the patient's preferred method of communication. Is it letter by mail? Is it email? And then the timing of that's got to work with everything else. And of course, like everything in this, the whole communications plan, your attorney's got to sign off on it, and it's going to go back and forth, a million times. But before you send those things out, and, it might be your call center doing it. It depends on the scope of the breach. It might be, the company itself, but you've got to have all those systems in place to deal with the questions, because that first week, it's all hands on deck. Fielding questions like we talked about with, patients who are just calling to make sure it's legitimate. That's most of it. Hey, I got this letter. Is this the real thing? Yeah, it's a real thing. Okay, thanks. Making sure that you inform them that, here are your rights, because you do have rights as someone whose information has been stolen. And, usually it's free credit monitoring. Through the call center, call and sign up. And then people get a little, nervous about, but somebody stole my information. So now you're asking me to give this call center more information.
I know.
There's never a perfect plan, right? But, you've got to have the things in place, and usually they get a lot out of that, the scouring the dark web for your identity. And, usually it lasts about a year or so. I guess it's very custom adjust them depending upon the scope of the breach. But really try to inform people that you do have rights now, that we're not leaving you out to dry, and just fielding their questions and paranoia about it, which rightfully so. We all should be very paranoid when that happens.
Yeah. I mean, and you bring up a good point about the credit monitoring and breach monitoring and all that kind of stuff. That has become kind of a de facto basic thing you should do. And in fact, in breaches where we've seen people or organizations not do that, it hasn't fared very well in the public relations arena for them.
Right.
And so that's something you definitely want to do. And I would say most people probably don't take you up on the offer. So, it's not like you have to worry about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people doing that. A lot of people either already have something in place, like I already have something in place. So it's not going to do me any good to take you up on your offer, already pay for that.
Right.
And some people even have the mentality that, well, as you said earlier in the beginning, okay, well, I got breached, yesterday too. So who cares? There's nothing I can do about this, so what? I've been breached so many times now. What difference does it make? And so you'll have people do that too, but you certainly should have that in place where you're going to offer something to help protect them. And you and I both know, and most of our listeners know, the criminals will just hold on to the information for more than a year if they wanted to. So
for sure.
It's not like it's fully protecting somebody, but it's better than nothing. And you're trying to say, look, I'm taking some responsibility for what happened and helping you to some degree, helping you avoid any further fallout from this happening.
Yeah, it's a valuable service. I mean, my husband works in cybersecurity, and so all of our stuff is locked down like crazy. And I've even had my identity stolen. And when I found, somebody had my social security number and they tried to add themselves to my credit card. And I spent the whole next day going through everything that I needed to do, that whole checklist, which is, a whole different podcast. But I did everything I was supposed to do, including filing the police report. Thank God I did that. Fast forward a year later, day before we closed on a home. And it's like, okay, we can't close because you've got this outstanding balance on a whatever. It's like, I never even heard of that credit card, but here's the police report. And we could close. It's like, it's just so important to take advantage of that opportunity when you have it. So monitor that credit. Yeah.
It's funny you should say that because I always pull my credit reports annually, and I do it on my birthday because I can remember that easily. And I just had a birthday last week, and I pulled my credit reports, and I haven't had time to go through them yet, but I did skim them, and I saw some things in there. I was like, I don't know what this is. It's not me. Yeah. So I've got to go back through those. It's that time of year, and it takes a while because you're talking 75 pages worth of stuff from 3 different credit reporting agencies. So it's a long process to look through all that, but in more than one occasion, I have found things reported on my credit that were not me.
Right.
So you have to fight those and get them off. And it's not as hard as it used to be. It's to get that done. But checking your credit report is something everybody should do annually, I believe, at least annually.
Right. And to have it for free for whatever duration, usually a year. I mean, that's a benefit. Take advantage of it. Your data may not have been stolen, but here's a cool freebie.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's usually enlightening.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. A little scary.
Yeah. Okay. So the next one we talked about a little bit, and so I don't know if you want to go back over any of this part, but we talked about knowing how to work with an outsourced call center.
Yeah. And we I think touched on the most important parts of that. It's, you give them the script, let your communications person, your PR person be engaged in that process. That's so important. And then, like I said, I can't stress enough the importance of the quality control piece of that. And what I would also do, if it's possible, is figure out who your secret shoppers are going to be, your mystery callers, and go ahead and put them on the list that you send of the people involved in the breach, knowing that these are your test people, but that's not obvious to the call center, obviously, because you can have people call and say, hey, I was just heard about the breach. I'm just wondering if that affected me. They'll look it up and say no. And then they can, you can engage in other questions. But if if, it's a true test and they're on the list, and then you hear the whole spiel about, okay, well, here's what you need to do. That's a little better. So if you can put those test people and, maybe have, you can even get cute about it and say, okay, their initials have to spell this or something, and we know it's a test case.
Mm-hmm.
But I would do that at least once a day for a while, and just make sure that you're feeling confident about your call center, because, these are, they're learning quickly how to respond to your questions, and sometimes they don't hit the mark.
Yeah. Yeah. They don't have that, buy-in necessarily. Like, they don't work for the organization the same way.
No. And what's nice is, I had a direct line of communications with with some of the managers in the call center, and I could call them and say, hey, so we had a test call on this day at this time. Can you pull the recording and listen to it, please?
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, ooh, sorry. Okay, more training.
Yeah.
And they don't listen to every recording. They can't possibly. And they're not vested in it like you are.
Right. And so that leads us to the next tip, which is to establish an internal escalation line, because we know not everybody's going to want to talk to the outsourced call center. All right.
And not the call center can't answer some of the more technical questions. And, when I talk to people who were on the escalation line, if they were to, sometimes I couldn't answer them either. And a few of them we had to escalate to the CEO because they just needed that level of assurance. But that's rare. That's really rare. Most people, like we talked about, just need to be heard and need to be assured that this is indeed legitimate. Yeah. And so, I'll reiterate that part about, having those business cards printed very quickly to distribute throughout your organization that has the number of that escalation line, because you want your people who are patient facing or customer facing to feel like they're helping, but they can't really say much. But here's something you can do. Here's a card I can give you, and you can call them and you can ask those questions there, because those are the people who are the most up to date with the information. It's not so much us in the clinic, because we're focused on patient care. And that's the kind of thing we want to hear them say.
Right.
Not like, well, latest I heard was this. No, none of that.
Yeah, that could end up bad.
Yeah.
All right. So the last one you have here is have a process for notifying the media. Wow.
Yeah, that's the necessary evil, because as a PR person, we're brought up in our careers to think, okay, we've got to get those great media placements. Did it make the paper? Did it make the news? And here's the situation where that's not the goal. The goal is to meet your requirement of notifying the media, but to stay out of the news.
That's right.
And then really, it very much depends on the size and the scope of the organization, whether the media cares about it or not. So there's a few things to keep in mind about that. It's like, well, yes, you have an obligation to notify the media. You don't have to put it out on the newswire. That is not your obligation to do. For this one in particular, I sent it to one of the editors of the AJC, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and in this situation, at the advice of counsel, we only needed to send it to the major daily in Atlanta, and which doesn't mean we want to send it to anybody else. That is the minimum requirement we had to do, and that's what we did. And we don't have to send it on an ideal day. I like sending press releases on a Tuesday. Send this one on a Tuesday. I think we probably sent it on maybe a Thursday or Friday, and keep the receipts. So, I did screenshots of here's the response. Here's the screenshot of where I sent it. And I can't recall if I got an auto response or not, probably not, but I had the screenshot of sending it. And then every day you get up and check the paper. Did it appear? Did it appear? Did it appear? And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but your goal is to not, because you want it to be non-news, but you've met your requirement. And then if it does hit the paper, then you know who your spokespeople are. And generally it should be your CEO talking about it. And you've already drilled them some more and have them practice with the worst possible question. Ask, I always like to ask my client, what are the worst questions anybody could ask you? What do you not want to answer? And that's where we start, because it's very rare that those are the ones they get. They usually get the softball questions, but start with the hardest ones and be prepared for those.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, people want to get media coverage until something like this happens, and then they don't, they don't want any media coverage.
Right. But then it also has to go on your website. And you have to do your due diligence with notifications. So that's some social media too. And, it doesn't have to be on the banner, but it has to be visible. So
let's talk about the social media thing for a minute, because we did a podcast recording when Scripps had a data breach, and it was, as we were recording, we were watching the fallout happen, and you would see people on their Facebook page asking questions. They were obviously patients. And early on, you would see responses oftentimes from people who work there who I'm assuming, but pretty sure they weren't the ones assigned to be doing this.
Right.
They were just simply
they still work there.
Yeah, maybe not, but they would respond to it like it was, hey, we're having a ransomware attack or whatever. And then you would see somebody else respond, hey, I work here and blah, blah, blah. And in the early stages, the responses were very bad because it would be things that somebody would say, well, what am I supposed to do about my appointment that I'm having at Tuesday at 2:00? And somebody would respond back with something like, let me look that up for you or whatever. And it's like, whoa, slow down, dude. You can't do this over social media.
Wow.
You're going to have another data breach or HIPAA violation at the very least happening because of this. And then after about a day or so, you started seeing the messaging very uniform and coming from one person. So you could tell when that, kind of when things started hitting the PR person or whoever was in charge of getting that under control. But in the beginning, it was very much the Wild West of everybody responding and people, jump in. I work there and this is what's going on. It's almost like akin to when you have, like an incident in a big metropolitan area, and they're trying to find anybody who works there to put a camera in their face. What's going on? Is it a fire inside? Is it a active shooter inside? You got anybody you're trying to just give you information, and people sometimes are just so willing to jump in front of a camera.
Well, yeah. And, you never want to look like you're controlling the message. But if it gets totally out of hand, and like you said, it looks like the Wild West, might have been time to lock down the social media.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Moderated. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, companies can have the worst things on their social media that you can imagine. But what makes it better is how the company responds to it. And we're sorry you had this situation. And here's the number to call about this. And, let's talk about this. Let me help you with that. I mean, that's all you can do at that point. And that goes back to the training from the beginning, where people should know that they don't speak on behalf of the company. That's not their job. And, just having the right people in place before any of this happens could have prevented all of that. That sounds like a mess.
Yeah. So I always warn people, be careful of the social media, because everybody goes to that for information. And sometimes your employees will go to that and they'll start responding. And so now, instead of the phone calls coming in and you're controlling the messaging, because you're like, okay, all of our messaging is coming in by phone, so let's have this message to give them. And you're like, wait a minute, no, all of it's not coming in by phone. It's coming in by phone. It's coming in by Facebook. It's coming in by Twitter. It's coming in by LinkedIn. It's like, oh my gosh, you got to handle all those things.
Well, and there should already be a plan in place of how do you handle your social media anyway. Where it gets a little scary is when it goes on, sites like Health Grades or Rate My Doc or all of those other sites where, you have no control over those.
Yeah, no kidding. And I guess I should correct myself. It's not Twitter anymore. It's X.
Whatever it is this week.
Yeah, it's going to take a while to get used to that one.
That's a PR problem in itself.
Yeah. All right. So, Karen, thanks for coming on the show and telling everybody about the steps they need to take to get a good PR program in place. But I want you to let people know how they can get this download for this PDF and more about how to get in touch with you as well if they need to talk to you about getting some of your services or asking questions about what we talked about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is phillipsmarek.com. So Phillips, Phillips, Marek, Marek.com. And go to the download section. This is on our downloads page, and you can take a look at it there. Give us a call if you have any questions. Happy to chat about it.
All right. Very good. Well, folks, that's our show for today. Thanks again for listening. And be sure to share this out because people need to know what to do before a breach happens. And this is one of those kind of hidden gems that you need to be thinking about. So remember, for Donna and myself and Karen as well, that HIPAA is not about compliance. It's about patient care.
You've been listening to the Help Me with HIPAA podcast, hosted by Donna Grindle and David Sims. The show created to help you with HIPAA. For more information or to ask us a question, visit our website at helpmewithhipaa.com. Neither Donna Grindle or David Sims are attorneys, and they do not offer binding legal advice concerning regulatory compliance. The information in this podcast should not be relied upon or construed as legal advice in any way. Consult your attorney for legal advice concerning compliance with HIPAA regulations.